This class will discuss two chapters in Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, Chapter 12 and Chapter 16. These chapters are the first chapters of the two parts of Capital Volume 1, Part 4 and Part 5. As we discuss in our second class, the structure of capital and the presentation of the material are carefully constructed by Marx. The concepts and arguments are not casually scattered throughout the pages of Capital. Let us reflect on what we have in Part 4 and Part 5 and how the material is presented first. Part 4 is about the production of relative surplus value. Marx developed the concept of surplus value and identified the source of surplus value before this Part 4. However, the analysis of the concept of surplus value was relatively abstract. The reference was to capitalism in general. In that context, there was also an introduction to the absolute surplus value concept, which is determined by the length of the working day. In this new part, Part 4, Marx introduced a critical concept, relative surplus value. Because the concept is unknown, it must be defined first. Therefore, Marx understandably devoted the first chapter of this part, Chapter 12, to explain the concept of relative surplus value and its determinant, namely to labor productivity. Again, because the labor productivity is directly related to the mechanization and the type of mode of production, the rest of Part 4 discusses these modes: cooperation, division of labor and manufacture, and machinery and large-scale industry in three different chapters, chapters 13, 14, and 15. I strongly recommend reading those chapters since they give us a good sense of the history of capitalist development based on technological advancement. Our discussion of the first chapter, Chapter 12, clarifies the concept of relative surplus value, whereas the following three chapters, chapters 13, 14, 15, make direct and concrete connections between the concept and changing characteristics of the labor process as capitalism develops. We are now in the capitalist reality, moving from a relatively abstract discussion of the concepts, including variable capital, surplus value, and rate of surplus value in capitalism in general, and any given working day, say 10-hour working day, can be divided into two parts: the necessary labor time and surplus labor time. In the first part of the working day, the necessary part, the worker must produce the amount of value equivalent to the value of his labor power, for which the capitalist pays a certain amount of wage, say $5. Beyond that, part of the working day, worker continues to work for another 5 hours, which constitutes the surplus labor time when surplus value is produced. Given the fixed length of the working day, 10 hours, the only way capitalist appropriates more surplus value is to reduce the necessary labor time. Let us further assume that $5 represent the value of labor power. The latter, that is, the value of labor power, is the value of the commodities required to reproduce labor power. What kind of commodities? Obviously, all the necessary things workers and their family members need to survive. For example, food, clothing, etc. The composition and quantity of this consumption basket very much depend on the historical circumstances, level of development, cultures, habits, etc. As in Marx's example of, quote, shirts, which are necessary means of subsistence, but are only one out of many. So, if in those sectors where the commodities that workers buy, that is, in consumer goods sectors, labor productivity rises because of changes in technology, changes in the mode of producing those goods, then the value of such goods declines. Since an increase in labor productivity means 1 hour of labor time is now allocated to more commodities, each commodity will have less value in itself. Hence, the necessary labor time goes down to reflect this fall in the value of consumption goods, say from 5 hours to 4 hours. Correspondingly, wages may fall from $5 to $4 with no change in the standard of living. The only changes initiated by the increase in labor productivity in the consumption goods sector are reducing the necessary labor time from 5 hours to 4 hours and increasing the surplus labor time from 5 to 6 hours. This type of increase is what Marx calls the production of relative surplus value. Redividing the working day as 4 hours and 6 hours, representing the necessary and surplus labor times, respectively, means a new and higher rate of surplus value. Previous 100%, 5 hours divided by 5 hours, now becomes 150%, 6 hours divided by 4 hours. Marx defines this new concept of relative surplus value and compares it with the absolute surplus value in the following way. Let me directly quote from Marx. The surplus value produced by prolongation of the working day, I call absolute surplus value. On the other hand, the surplus value arising from the curtailment of the necessary labor time and from the corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the two components of the working day, I call relative surplus value. End of the quote. The critical question we should ask this: why do those capitalists who function in those sectors producing means of subsistence for workers introduce new technologies which raise the productivity of labor? The one-word answer is competition. Let us see how Marx makes this point. Directly quoting from Marx again, he says, whenever an individual capitalist cheapens shirts by increasing the productiveness of labor, he by no means necessarily aims at reducing the value of labor power and shortening necessary labor time. But it is only insofar as he ultimately contributes to this result that he assists in raising the general rate of surplus value. The general and necessary tendencies of capital must be distinguished from their forms of manifestation. Pay attention to Marx's reference to the general and necessary tendencies of capital, which are, in this context, as he puts it, those, quote, coercive laws of competition as the directing motives of the capitalist's operations. And he continues, he says, the law of determination of value by labor time, a law which brings under its sway the individual capitalist who applies the new method of production by compelling him to sell his goods under their social value. The same law, acting as a coercive law of competition, forces his competitors to adopt the new method. The general rate of surplus value is, therefore, ultimately affected by the whole process. Only when the increase in productiveness of labor has seized upon those branches of production that are connected with and has cheapened those commodities that form part of the necessary means of subsistence and are therefore elements of the value of labor power. The result seems somewhat counterintuitive. More productive workers do not mean more value production. Instead, it simply means more use value, since an hour of labor always produces the same amount of value. According to Marx, this is one of the riddles that many economists couldn't answer correctly because they did not distinguish between use value and exchange value. Part 5 is about the production of absolute and relative surplus value. Although Marx already defined the concept of surplus value and these related concepts, absolute and relative surplus value, he continues to explore them further in the following 3 chapters of Part 5. Absolute and relative surplus value, and then changes of magnitude in the price of labor power and in surplus value, and various formula for the rate of surplus value, chapters 16, 17, and 18. By doing so, Marx put together Part 3, absolute surplus value, and Part 4, relative surplus value. He also clarifies and specifies what he means for productive labor in capitalism. Moreover, this discussion of the labor process and productive labor enabled him to criticize the leading classical economists' notion of profit, including Ricardo's and Mill's. Chapter 16 starts with a reminder. How did Marx discuss the labor process in the earlier part of Capital, chapter 7? Let me directly quote. He says, "The labor process we began by treating it in the abstract, apart from its historical forms, as a process between man and nature. In this context," he continues, "the labor process is purely individual. As capitalism develops," he says, "the product is not direct product of the individual and becomes a social product, produced in common by a collective laborer, that is, by a combination of workmen, each of whom takes only a part, greater or less, in the manipulation of the subject of their labor. This very process of moving from a general and abstract treatment of labor process to the analysis of the labor process in capitalism and historically specific enables Marx to define productive labor in capitalism as well. I'm directly quoting from Marx. He says that laborer alone is productive, who produces surplus value for the capitalist, and thus works for self-expansion of capital. The significance of the distinction between productive and unproductive labor and productive-unproductive activities cannot be overemphasized. The distinction between productive and unproductive labor is crucial, both for the analysis of the trajectory of capitalism, the crisis-ridden and cyclical nature of capitalism, in general, and for an understanding of the peculiar features of late 20th century capitalism. That is, the increasing importance of unproductive economic activities like trade and finance. In my view, Marx is clear about his definition of productive labor and distinguishes his criteria for classifying labor as productive and unproductive from that of other classical economists, notably from Smith's, whose criteria included materiality. Smith considered only those laborers whose product is tangible, good rather than service in mainstream economic terminology. That is, all workers in service sectors automatically must be classified as unproductive. For Marx, the nature of the product, that is, material or immaterial, has nothing to do with its producer's classification as a productive or unproductive laborer. Interestingly enough, though Marx's example of a teaching factory in this chapter makes this point crystal clear, in recent times, some Marxists, for instance Nikos Poulantzas, used the materiality criterion for identifying both productive and unproductive laborers and members of the working class. Considering the complexity and interconnectedness of economic activities in modern capitalism, the following diagram attempts to show the productive labor for capital based on Marx's criteria, which was, on the one hand, you have to be wage laborer, and on the other hand, you have to produce surplus value for capital. Let us also see how this distinction between productive and unproductive labor would help us to observe the structural changes and the ramifications in the leading capitalist country, that is the USA. In terms of employment and wages, the unproductive worker shares substantially increased to 65% in wage share and to almost 50% in employment in the United States since the early 1960s. With this kind of increase, those unproductive sectors, chiefly trade and finance, share in GDP also increased. This is a significant structural change, which in turn limits the surplus value production capacity of US capitalism. Since the increasing surplus value production is the basis of both economic growth and expanding unproductive sectors, by definition, they do not produce surplus value. This very phenomenon of proportionate decrease in productive laborers is alarming for US capitalism, for that matter, for other major capitalist countries as well, since the pattern is observed throughout the world in all other leading capitalist economies.